Nathan Clark never thought he'd end up in a neighborhood like this. Quiet, immaculately trimmed hedges, morning joggers with identical earphones, and suburban silence so heavy it felt like a performance. After 3 decades on the road working as a heavy truck mechanic, he'd imagined retirement differently. Maybe somewhere near a river or a small cabin with a decent view. But when his older sister unexpectedly took a permanent job overseas and handed him the keys to her 2-bedroom ranch-style home, Nathan didn't ask questions. The house was paid off in a decent area and came with a wide garage he could finally call his own. After years of working in someone else's bay, fixing engines under flickering fluorescent lights while foremen barked schedules, he craved the kind of stillness where he could just fix things in peace, at his pace. Maybe even start tinkering with the old motorcycles he'd been dreaming about restoring since his 20s. The house was modest, but solid, with sun-bleached brick walls and a small backyard that sloped just enough to catch evening light. The garage was the crown jewel, a detached structure with deep shelves, a workbench covered in dust, and just enough space for a project bike or two. Or so he thought. Nathan moved in during the shoulder of spring, right when the air still held a bite but the birds were getting brave. He spent the first few days organizing the inside of the house, replacing old light fixtures, oiling cabinet hinges, scrubbing baseboards. He hadn't even touched the garage yet. He'd saved that as a reward. On the 5th day, after a full morning clearing out the laundry room and installing a new water filter, he finally took the garage keys from the pegboard by the kitchen and walked out back. He was humming under his breath, already imagining where he'd mount his tools. But when he reached the door, he stopped. The lock was unfamiliar, not the one he remembered his sister using years ago. He tried the key. It didn't even fit. Assuming it had simply rusted or warped, Nathan fetched his toolbox and carefully removed the lock. It slid off more easily than he expected. When he opened the door, he was met not by emptiness or dust, but by a wall of clutter. Boxes stacked to the ceiling, a sagging couch, piles of clothing sealed in yellowing plastic, furniture parts, holiday decorations, old humidifiers, multiple folding chairs, a wire shelf crammed with jars, canned goods, and what looked like outdated VHS tapes. The air smelled like lavender and mildew, like someone had tried to keep it clean but had long since given up. He stood frozen for a few seconds, taking it in. None of this was his. None of it was his sister's. Some of the boxes were labeled in Sharpie: Easter, plastic eggs, toys, Ryan, China, fragile. Others had tags stuck to them with fading stickers marked KC in curly penmanship. As he stepped deeper into the space, he noticed a folding table covered with what looked like price tags, a portable fan, and a broken clock radio. There was even a sleeping cot wedged in one corner, complete with a deflated air mattress. This wasn't just storage. Someone had set up shop. Nathan closed the door slowly, locked it again out of habit, and went back inside, unsure of what to make of it. That evening, as he sat on the back step sipping his coffee, a voice pierced the stillness. "Oh, good. You're finally in. I was wondering when I'd get to meet you." A woman was standing by the chain-link fence that divided his backyard from the one next door. She looked to be in her 50s, large-framed with a floral robe thrown over tight gray leggings. She had short, curled hair dyed too dark, with roots that hinted at a more natural silver. She waved as if they were old friends reunited. "I'm Karen," she said brightly. "I live right there." She pointed toward the light blue house next door, barely 2 car lengths away. "Your sister was just lovely. We were very close. I use the garage sometimes. She let me store a few things. She didn't tell you?" Nathan blinked. "No, she didn't." Karen chuckled as if that were no big deal. "Probably forgot. She knew I was in a tough spot. This neighborhood's great, but we don't all have space like you do. That garage was a lifesaver. Anyway, I'm so glad you're here. If you need anything, tools, help finding the best grocery store, just ask. I'm always around." And with that, she turned and disappeared back into her yard, waving one last time before the fence blocked her from view. Nathan sat still for a while, unsure whether he'd just had a neighborly conversation or been informed of a silent invasion. The next morning, he opened the garage again and stood looking at the chaos inside. It didn't feel like a favor. It felt like a takeover. Over the next 2 days, Nathan began moving some of the boxes, stacking them neatly near the entrance. He didn't touch anything fragile, didn't open any lids, but by day 3, a few of the boxes he'd moved were back in their original place. Not only that, but there were more. A battered armchair had appeared, a rack of dresses, a plastic tub filled with shoes. On the 4th day, as he was hauling out a cracked-end table to leave by the side gate, Karen showed up again, this time holding a Tupperware container. "Thought you could use a little something," she said cheerily, thrusting the container into his hands. "Peach cobbler. Store-bought crust. Don't worry, I'm not a baker." Nathan nodded but didn't thank her. "About the garage," he said calmly. "I'm going to need that space back." Karen's smile didn't budge. "Oh, honey, I totally get that. But this is temporary. Just until I sort through a few things. I've got a big sale coming up. You know how it is. I'd move it all tomorrow if I could, but lifting's hard on my back, and honestly, I'm kind of in between helpers right now." She gave him a pointed look as if hoping he'd volunteer. He didn't. "I'll give you a week," Nathan said. "Then it's got to be cleared." Karen's face flickered for a moment, her pleasant mask slipping just enough for a glimpse of something harder beneath. But it passed quickly. She patted his shoulder, uninvited, and waddled back to her yard. That night, he locked the garage again. The next morning, the lock had been changed. Again. Nathan stared at the door for a long time, then walked back into the house without a word. He didn't shout. He didn't knock on her door. He sat down with a notebook and made a list. Locks, lawyer, storage unit, camera. He underlined each word slowly. He wasn't going to escalate things emotionally. He was going to handle it the way he'd handled every machine that refused to run, calmly, step by step, until it worked again. What Karen didn't understand was that some people didn't yell when they were angry. Some people just got very, very thorough. And Nathan Clark was nothing if not thorough. Nathan didn't rush to act, but that didn't mean he was idle. Over the next 2 days, he walked the perimeter of the property, noting every angle from which someone could access the garage. He found that the side gate between his yard and Karen's had no lock, just a decorative latch. That explained how she was getting in so easily. He went to the hardware store and bought a heavy-duty chain and padlock, then secured the gate without a word to anyone. The next morning, he found the chain loosened, not cut, but deliberately unclasped, as if to send a message. "You don't decide what stays locked." He didn't react. He simply removed the chain and replaced it with a bolt latch mounted directly into the wood. It wouldn't be opened without tools, and not quietly. That same afternoon, as he returned from picking up his mail, he noticed an envelope wedged into the screen door. No postage, just folded paper and Karen's distinctive cursive handwriting on the front. Friendly reminder. Inside was a passive-aggressive note thanking him for being understanding about the storage situation, and a request to not move her sentimental belongings until she could schedule proper transportation. At the bottom, she'd underlined the phrase, legally, obligated to preserve personal property during transitions of ownership, as though quoting some formal statute. It was the kind of note meant to look official to someone unfamiliar with the law, but Nathan saw it for what it was, an attempt at intimidation dressed in sugary language. She was staking her claim. He brought the letter inside, laid it flat on the kitchen table, and took a picture. Then he opened the drawer beside the fridge and pulled out the folder his sister had left for him, the one with the property deed, title transfer documents, and utility info. He flipped through until he found the original structure inventory. The house, the land, and the detached garage were all under his name. No co-ownership, no lease, no storage agreement with anyone. Karen had no legal grounds to use that garage, not for a single box. Still, Nathan wasn't interested in confrontation. What he wanted was resolution without drama. He called a local law office that handled civil property disputes and scheduled a consultation. He didn't bring up Karen's name or the situation in detail, just asked for advice on removing unauthorized property from a privately owned structure. The lawyer, a young man with a calm voice and sharp clarity, explained that as long as the garage was part of Nathan's deed, he had every right to restrict access, and even to dispose of anything left inside, provided he made reasonable attempts to notify the other party and give them time to retrieve their belongings. When Nathan mentioned that the person had already been told and had responded by changing the lock, the lawyer gave a soft chuckle. "That actually helps you. That's not shared use. That's unauthorized occupation." Nathan thanked him, scheduled a follow-up to get a written notice drafted, and hung up. That evening, he changed the lock again, this time to a keyed deadbolt he installed himself. Then he printed a formal-looking notice using the exact language the lawyer had suggested, that all items inside the garage must be removed within 5 business days, or they would be considered abandoned property. He laminated it, affixed it to the garage door, and made a copy for his records. For good measure, he slid a second copy under Karen's front door. She didn't respond that night. But the next day, Nathan woke up to the sound of something metallic scraping against concrete. He pulled aside the curtain in the bedroom and saw Karen, dressed in a bright pink tracksuit, dragging a wheeled cart piled high with new boxes toward his garage. She paused when she saw him watching, her eyes narrowing slightly, but she didn't break stride. Nathan stepped outside and met her halfway. "Karen," he said evenly, "you saw the notice." She exhaled loudly through her nose, feigning exasperation. "Oh, come on, Nathan. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. I've got stuff here I've had for years. Your sister was fine with it." He shook his head slowly. "My sister's not here anymore. This isn't shared space, and you're not moving in more junk. The deadline stands." Karen crossed her arms and tilted her head, her expression slipping into something darker. "You know, I've lived here longer than anyone else on this block. People trust me. I look after things. Your sister respected that. Maybe you should too." Nathan didn't flinch. 5 days. After that, it's all going." He turned and walked back toward the house. Behind him, he heard her mutter something under her breath, followed by the clatter of the cart being jerked around and dragged away. That evening, he checked the garage again. It was undisturbed. But early the next morning, something was off. His front gate, normally closed with a spring latch, was hanging wide open. As he walked out to investigate, he saw a smear of paint along the side of the garage, a thick, sloppy red streak about shoulder height, as if someone had brushed past it carrying something heavy and careless. He looked closer and saw scuff marks on the ground leading to the back wall. Inside, he found 2 large garbage bags full of clothing he didn't recognize. Karen had snuck in again. Nathan didn't call the police. He documented it, photos, timestamps, and emailed them to his lawyer, who replied with a brief message. "This is escalating. You're doing everything right. Stick to the timeline." On the 4th day, Nathan visited a nearby storage facility and rented a 5x10 unit. He returned home and began methodically removing every item from the garage that wasn't his. He labeled each box, numbered them, and made an itemized list. Everything was photographed, then packed carefully into his truck and driven to the unit. He didn't throw anything away. Yet. He wanted no accusations of theft or damage. When the garage was finally cleared, Nathan stood in the empty space for a long moment, inhaling the clean emptiness. It was the first time it had felt like his since moving in. He locked it, double-checked the latch, and walked back inside. The next morning there was a note on his windshield, this one not folded politely but taped flat across the glass. It was written in angry block letters, all caps, "You stole my property. I will be contacting authorities." Nathan peeled it off slowly and dropped it in the trash. He made no reply, But later that day, a knock came at the door. A man in a pressed shirt introduced himself as a community mediator, someone hired by Karen to resolve a civil misunderstanding. Nathan listened politely, then handed the man the documents, photos, and lawyer's contact information. "There's no misunderstanding," he said. "She left items in a space she doesn't own. I gave her written notice. I have legal support. This isn't a dispute. It's just over." The mediator nodded, skimmed the papers, and excused himself. That night, Nathan received a call from his lawyer. Karen had attempted to file a theft report, but it had been declined. Insufficient grounds. Her case was falling apart. Still, Nathan didn't celebrate. He didn't smile or breathe easy. He knew people like Karen didn't stop when they lost. They doubled down. And he wasn't done preparing. By the time the 6th day rolled around, Nathan had begun to notice a subtle shift in the air around the neighborhood. People were watching him, not overtly, not in any accusatory way, but with that cautious, sidelong glance that carries a silent question. "Are you the one making trouble?" He could feel it most in the early mornings when he'd step out to retrieve the newspaper or water the patchy strip of grass along the walkway. A woman across the street, watering her flower beds, would pause just long enough for it to be awkward. A pair of men who usually walk their dogs at the same time every morning stopped waving, their conversations turning more hushed when passing his yard. It wasn't overt hostility, but something quieter. A growing discomfort, likely seeded by Karen's words whispered just loud enough to travel. Nathan didn't react. He kept his posture straight, his expression neutral, and his voice steady whenever spoken to. He wasn't looking to win popularity contests, and he'd long ago stopped expecting fairness from groups that valued familiarity over facts. That afternoon, Nathan returned from a trip to the hardware store with a new shelving unit for the garage, only to find the side of his house had been egged. Not the front, not where passers-by could easily see and react. Just the hidden strip between the garage and the neighbor's fence. The eggs had dried in the midday sun, crusting against the siding and dripping onto the concrete like some juvenile threat. Nathan set down the shelf box, took a few photos with his phone, and retrieved a bucket and sponge. He didn't call the police. He didn't knock on Karen's door. He cleaned it in silence. Later that evening, he installed a motion-activated floodlight above the garage door and angled it to catch any movement coming from the side fence or backyard gate. He wasn't looking for conflict, but he wasn't going to be caught sleeping either. The next escalation came quietly. So quietly, in fact, that Nathan almost missed it. He was sorting through a drawer of old tools inside the garage when he heard a soft metallic click from the side of the house. He stepped outside just in time to see Karen walking briskly away from his front gate, a rolled paper tucked under her arm and a smug, satisfied look frozen on her face. When he reached the gate, he found another letter, this time in an envelope stamped with a community resource logo. It was a citation notice, claiming that his property had received 2 formal complaints, one regarding the aggressive repurposing of shared-use space, and another citing hostile conduct toward long-standing residents. There were no names, just language vague enough to sound serious, yet hollow upon inspection. Nathan wasn't fooled. He took it inside, scanned it, and forwarded it to his lawyer, who replied curtly, "Not enforceable. Keep the document. Do not respond." Still, something about the phrase hostile conduct gnawed at him. Not because it was true, but because it signaled Karen was now playing the long game. She wasn't trying to win outright. She was trying to grind him down slowly, to isolate him, wear him out, push him into acting out so she could claim vindication. That night, Nathan sat on his porch long after the sun had disappeared behind the rooftops, his fingers wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. He wasn't a man prone to bitterness, but the idea that someone could weaponize community niceness, twist it into a tool of exclusion and manipulation, made his jaw tighten. Karen didn't want his garage. She wanted control. Over perception, over reputation, over who got to claim ownership of belonging. The real blow came 2 days later. Nathan had just returned from the county office where he'd been pulling records to ensure there were no legal easements or clerical gaps Karen could exploit, when he noticed that the side gate had been forced open. The new bolt had been broken, not cleanly but with force, the splintered wood revealing the kind of pry mark left by a crowbar. He moved quickly around the side, heart hammering harder than it should have, and flung open the garage. The sight stopped him cold. Karen's belongings, what he'd carefully boxed and labeled and moved to the storage unit, had returned. Not all of them, but enough to send a message. 3 boxes of clothing, a wooden chest, a broken coffee table, and a stack of framed photographs had been dumped unceremoniously in the middle of the garage floor. But that wasn't the worst part. Taped to the wall was a printed sign, hastily slapped up and crooked. Property in transition. Do not remove. It wasn't official, just printed in bold font and laminated in cheap plastic, but the implication was clear. Karen was pretending this was some sort of shared storage zone again, banking on Nathan's hesitance to cause a scene. He didn't hesitate this time. He called the storage unit, confirmed he still had access, and reloaded every item into the back of his truck. He didn't label them again. He didn't photograph. He'd already done his due diligence. Now it was about re-establishing the boundary. He returned everything to the unit and changed the access code. Then he drove to a locksmith, paid out of the pocket for a reinforced deadbolt and a secondary padlock system, and installed them himself that night. When he was done, he stepped outside, wiped the sweat from his brow, and stared into the darkened yard. He didn't say anything aloud, but the look in his eyes was the same one he'd had when tearing out rusted bolts in sub-zero weather on the side of an interstate. It said, "I'm not done, and I don't lose ground." The next morning, he received a letter, not hand-delivered this time but in a proper stamped envelope. Inside was a summons, a notice informing him that Karen was pursuing a civil complaint. The basis: unlawful disposal of property, emotional distress, and intentional damage to neighborly relations. It was pure fiction, but it was real enough to require a response. Nathan contacted his lawyer immediately, who assured him they'd handle it. Still, the message was clear. Karen wasn't going away. She was escalating the conflict to formal levels now, trying to weaponize the legal system the same way she had weaponized politeness. Nathan didn't feel afraid, but he did feel tired. Not in the physical sense, but in the way you get when you realize the person pushing against you has no intention of stopping, not even when they're clearly in the wrong. That night, Nathan did something he hadn't done in years. He sat down at the kitchen table with a legal pad and began to write. Not a letter, not a journal, but a sequence of contingency plans. Steps, actions, responses. If Karen escalates further, do X. If she violates boundaries again, do Y. It wasn't about paranoia. It was about staying ahead of a pattern he now understood intimately. Karen thrived in the gray area between polite society and legal ambiguity. She counted on people's reluctance to make things messy. Nathan was done worrying about messy. He had the truth, the law, and a stubborn sense of justice on his side. And soon he would have a plan that would end this, completely and permanently. The summons didn't shake Nathan, but it did shift something in him. There was a specific weight in realizing someone had decided to entangle you in a legal process not out of desperation, but as a tactic, as a calculated attempt to disrupt your life, waste your time, drain your patience, and see if you'd fold. Karen wasn't trying to win a case. She was trying to win the long, silent war of erosion. It was a bet, and Nathan had seen this kind of bet before, not in courtrooms but in repair bays and truck yards where small mistakes were ignored just long enough to become dangerous. He knew what happened when you ignored something that was clearly broken and refused to call it by its name. Karen was broken. Somewhere in her story, some gear had locked out of alignment, and now she thought everything belonged to her if she said it sweetly enough. But Nathan wasn't a mechanic here. He couldn't wrench this thing back into place. What he could do was act precisely, document thoroughly, and make damn sure that when this story was told, no one would call him the villain. His lawyer, a lean woman named Gloria Alvarez with a voice like sandpaper and a memory like a vault, met him at the office 2 days after the summons arrived. She wasn't concerned. She flipped through Karen's filing with a kind of measured contempt, pausing only to raise an eyebrow at phrases like emotional harm due to loss of heirloom property and spiritual dislocation caused by forced eviction. "She's throwing spaghetti at the wall," Gloria said calmly. "She's hoping something sticks, and more importantly, she's hoping you'll overreact so she can claim harassment or retaliation. Our job is to be still, precise, efficient." Nathan liked her immediately. He answered her questions clearly, handed over every document he'd kept, every photo, every time-stamped message. He didn't embellish. He didn't vent. He simply laid the truth out in order. Gloria smiled halfway through and nodded. "You're not just legally safe, you're narratively clean. That matters." On the way back home, Nathan stopped at a local cafe, not out of habit but because he didn't want to walk straight back into silence. The air inside smelled like cinnamon and burnt coffee, the booths worn down with years of elbows and talk. He sipped a cup slowly, thinking not about the court date, but about the garage. It was still his, still sealed, but it didn't feel untouched anymore. The space had been violated, repurposed, and dragged into a power struggle that made it heavier to enter. He needed to reclaim it, not with locks or warnings, but with action. That afternoon, Nathan drove to a second-hand supply store and bought pegboard, oil-resistant mats, and 3 new drawers for tools. Then he stopped at a specialty paint shop and picked out a deep, cool gray that reminded him of the trucks he used to work on. When he got home, he cleared the garage completely, not of junk, which was already gone, but of residue. He wiped every surface, opened every window, and let the air flow through. Then he painted the walls, installed the pegboard, mounted the lighting, and set the mats. Over the course of 2 days, he turned the space into something new. Not a defense post, not a barricade, but a workshop. His workshop. But as always, calm came with a price. On the 3rd morning, as he stood in the doorway of the garage admiring the clean lines and new order, he noticed a small square package at his feet. No label. No writing. He opened it carefully, suspecting nothing but expecting something, and found a stack of photos. They were printed on regular paper, poorly aligned and slightly grainy, but unmistakable. They showed him outside, cleaning the side of the house, hauling boxes, speaking to a man who looked like a community liaison. And one, just one, showed him seated on the back porch, coffee in hand, face unguarded. Someone had been watching him. Karen had escalated again. It wasn't illegal, but it was telling. It confirmed what Nathan had begun to suspect, that she wasn't just reactive but proactive, strategic in her manipulation of appearances. These weren't the actions of someone simply offended. They were the tactics of a woman building a narrative, collecting evidence, and preparing a story where she played the patient, long-suffering neighbor victimized by a newcomer who didn't understand the unspoken rules of the street. Nathan considered confronting her, but the better part of him knew that silence had always been his sharpest weapon. She didn't want silence. She wanted spectacle. So instead, he took the photos inside, placed them in a Ziploc, labeled them with the date, and added them to the growing folder marked Documented Incidents. Then he called Gloria. "Good," she said without needing him to finish. "Keep documenting. She's playing chess. We'll play endgame." That weekend, Nathan invited his nephew, Marcus, 25 and recently laid off from an HVAC company, to come by. Not for help, not for defense, but because he didn't want the garage to turn into a bunker. He wanted it to be used. They spent the day tuning an old lawnmower and setting up a radio on a shelf Nathan had built from scrap wood. Music filled the space for the first time since he'd moved in. The sound didn't block out the tension completely, but it reminded him who the space was really for. That night, as they shared sandwiches on the porch, Marcus asked casually, "She's still giving you trouble?" Nathan didn't answer directly. He just nodded toward the garage and said, "Not in there." The real midpoint came the next morning, not through confrontation, but through a letter. This time from a local mediation board, inviting Nathan to attend a neighborly resolution meeting, scheduled in 2 weeks. Karen had requested it. Nathan wasn't required to accept, but the letter was worded carefully with phrases like community goodwill and voluntary conflict easing. Gloria advised him to go. It's neutral ground, it's on record, and if she acts up there, it's under scrutiny. Just don't take the bait. Nathan agreed, not because he expected resolution, but because he understood exactly what was at stake now. Karen had made the mistake of turning this into performance. But Nathan wasn't acting. He wasn't posturing. He was preparing. And the moment he walked into that meeting, she would realize the difference. The morning of the mediation meeting arrived without fanfare. Just gray skies and the slow drip of last night's rain clinging to the eaves. Nathan didn't dress for battle. He wore what he always wore. Dark jeans, clean boots, a faded button-up. He arrived early, took the seat furthest from the door, and observed in silence as the room filled. It wasn't a courtroom, just a bland municipal conference space with folding chairs, a circular table, and the faint smell of printer toner and old carpet. Karen arrived 3 minutes late, wearing a shawl and pearls like someone attending a garden tea. Her face set into the strained politeness of a person who'd already decided she was being wronged. She greeted the mediators with exaggerated warmth and avoided looking at Nathan altogether. The lead mediator, a soft-spoken man with a stack of forms and a stiff manner, introduced the session as a chance for mutual understanding and voluntary solutions. Nathan nodded once. Karen smiled without blinking. When she spoke, it was in the practiced cadence of someone who'd told this story more than once. How she had supported the previous homeowner, how she had stored items with her full knowledge and was now being punished for a neighborly act of trust. How she'd never been aggressive or invasive but was instead met with rudeness, forced removal of her property, and hostility. She described the garage not as his legal space, but as something shared, a communal buffer she had maintained during times of need. Her voice quavered when she mentioned being a woman alone, simply trying to preserve a sense of community. Nathan said nothing as she spoke. He didn't roll his eyes, didn't scoff. He waited. When it was his turn, he simply laid out the sequence of events, referencing dates, notices, photo evidence, correspondence, and the clearly defined terms of property ownership. He kept his tone neutral, factual, unmoved. He did not speculate. He did not accuse. He stated. When the mediator gently asked if there was any space for compromise, Nathan shook his head once and replied, "There's no ambiguity here. She entered a locked structure she doesn't own. She ignored formal notice. She returned property after removal. She filed a false complaint. And she's misrepresented the history of this situation to nearly everyone involved. I'm not interested in peace that only comes if I pretend none of that happened." Karen interrupted, politely, then sharply, then emotionally, until the mediator had to ask her to stop. Her calm cracked, just enough to reveal the irritation underneath. The session ended with no agreement. But Nathan didn't consider it a loss. He walked out knowing he'd presented his case in public under formal observation without raising his voice. That kind of presence couldn't be faked. The very next morning, the retaliation began. Not big, but deliberate. Someone had unscrewed the security light above the garage door. Nathan replaced the bulb and added a locking cage. That night, someone removed the batteries from the motion sensor by the gate. He switched it out for a hardwired model. A week later, someone left a dead potted plant on his front steps with a note that read, "Cold roots don't bloom." It was cryptic, but not threatening, just enough to suggest that someone wanted him off balance. But the worst came 2 weeks after the mediation, when Nathan received an anonymous letter mailed from a neighboring town. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a printed screenshot. His house, his driveway, captured from a street view map but altered. There were crude markings drawn in red, X's over the garage, arrows pointing to the yard, a question mark next to the roof. It looked like a diagram of a burglary, or at least the kind of thing meant to make him wonder. Nathan didn't show it to anyone, didn't talk about it, not even with Gloria. Instead, he went to the hardware store, bought a reinforced deadbolt system, and spent 3 hours upgrading every access point around the house and garage. He didn't sleep that night, not out of fear, but out of the grinding calculation of someone measuring the limits of another person's persistence. When Karen struck next, it was through official channels again. She filed a new complaint, this time to the local housing authority, alleging that Nathan was operating an unlicensed workshop out of his garage and disrupting the domestic character of the neighborhood. It was a laughably transparent move, especially since he'd barely started working on his first real project, a battered motorcycle frame he'd inherited from a cousin. But the complaint triggered an inspection. 2 men in utility jackets came out, poked around, asked questions. Nathan answered everything directly, showed them the zoning documents, the deed, and his workshop setup. There were no fumes, no commercial activity, no signage. One of the inspectors nodded and muttered, "Another fake one. Happens more than you'd think." Still, the visit had served its purpose. It reminded Nathan that Karen's strategy wasn't to win. It was to exhaust. Death by 1,000 paper cuts. After the inspectors left, Nathan made a decision. He returned to the storage unit where Karen's things had been stored since the first removal. He opened the unit, verified that everything was still there, and closed it for the last time. Then he printed 30 flyers and stapled them to bulletin boards, pinned them to gas station corkboards, left them on public benches. Each one bore a simple heading: "Free stuff. Everything must go." Below were photos of the items: boxes, furniture, crates, dated knickknacks, and a location. There was no name, no contact. Just the line: "Claim it while it's here. All unclaimed items will be disposed of next week." It wasn't revenge. It was resolution. Karen had been given time, access, and notice. The unit's rental was ending in 4 days. The items were now considered abandoned property. Nathan didn't need permission. He needed closure. By the end of the week, the unit was nearly empty. People had come in pickups, on foot, some curious, some thrilled. Nathan watched from his truck, parked half a block away. No one asked questions. No one cared who owned the stuff. It was old, it was unwanted, and now it was theirs. He drove away before the last crate was gone. He didn't want to see it vanish. He just wanted to know it was no longer his responsibility. 3 days later, Karen cornered him near the mailbox. Her smile was gone. Her voice was cold. "You think this is over?" she asked, low and hard. "You think I don't have more friends in this neighborhood than you ever will?" Nathan stared at her for a moment, then replied, "That's your problem, Karen. You think this is about who wins a popularity contest. But this is about property and rights and truth. And in that game, your friends can't help you." He turned and walked away, not fast, not angry, just finished. That night he checked the garage one last time. Clean, organized, tools mounted, lighting solid. He closed the door, locked it, and finally felt something close to peace. But he didn't let himself believe it would last. Because people like Karen rarely leave quietly. The final blow didn't come with shouting, sirens, or some dramatic confrontation. It came quietly, and for that reason alone, it hit harder. Nathan was on his knees in the garage adjusting the tension on a chain hoist he'd installed above the workbench when he heard a soft knock, not at the door, but at the side fence. A rhythm too polite to be a threat, but too insistent to be casual. He stepped outside and saw a woman standing near the gate. She wasn't from the neighborhood, that much was clear. Her shirt bore the badge of a municipal compliance agency, and she carried a tablet and clipboard in that bureaucratic way Nathan had come to recognize. The walk of someone who didn't need to raise their voice to make your life harder. She introduced herself, explained that she was there following up on an anonymous complaint regarding unlicensed waste disposal and the improper redistribution of private materials. It took Nathan a full 10 seconds to process the phrase before it. Hit him. Karen wasn't done. Somehow, she had discovered the final step he'd taken. The storage unit, the public giveaway, and now she was trying to spin it into criminal negligence. He kept his voice even, explained everything, showed her the rental contract, the notices, the photographs he'd taken before the flyers went out, the lawyer's letter confirming the items were lawfully considered abandoned. The inspector didn't accuse him of anything. She just took notes, asked measured questions, and left with a vaguely apologetic nod. But the fact that she had been sent at all was a clear sign that Karen had not simply lost. She had retreated, recalibrated, and fired again from another angle. Nathan stood in the driveway long after she was gone. Not angry, but stunned by the sheer persistence, the machinery of a person who could not admit loss without finding some new way to assert control. For a moment, he questioned whether he should have just left it alone. Let the boxes rot, left the garage untouched, allowed her to claim her little corner of intrusion in exchange for peace. But then he looked back at the garage, clean, orderly, and finally functional, and he remembered why he'd fought in the first place. Not out of pride, but because surrender would have infected everything that came after. That night, something changed. It wasn't a sound or a knock or a letter. It was a silence. A thick, artificial silence like the calm inside a vacuum. When Nathan stepped onto his back porch, he realized why. The motion light by the fence wasn't on. He checked the breaker. It hadn't tripped. He walked the line, followed the wiring, and found it had been neatly severed. Clean cut, not torn. Someone had taken wire cutters and disabled the system. He moved quickly, sweeping the area, and found more signs. The gate's latch was loose, the ground beneath it freshly disturbed. Someone had tried to come in again. But they hadn't. Not fully, not this time. Nathan didn't call the police. Instead, he retrieved a camouflage trail camera from the closet, one he'd once used during a brief camping phase, and mounted it inside the garage window, angled toward the fence and side yard. He connected it to an external power source and made sure it ran silently, continuously. Then he went to sleep, not deeply, but alert. At 3:42 a.m., the camera caught motion. He watched the footage the next morning, jaw tight, breath shallow. There she was, Karen, bundled in a hoodie and gloves, creeping across the grass with a flashlight gripped between her teeth and a trash bag in each hand. She moved quickly, as if she had done this before, as if this was routine. She approached the garage wall, crouched near the vent, and began emptying the bags. Rotten food, dead leaves, shards of broken pottery, organic waste. She wasn't trying to steal. She wasn't trying to get in. She was trying to make the space unusable, unsanitary, in violation of health codes. Nathan paused the footage, eyes locked on the grainy image of her face frozen mid-motion, and he realized that this wasn't a neighbor anymore. This was someone enacting a personal vendetta, a campaign of petty sabotage designed to destabilize a person's sense of home, safety, and ownership. It was surgical, and it had to stop. He didn't send the footage to Gloria. He didn't send it to the inspector. He took a USB drive, placed the video on it, and drove down to the local enforcement office. Not the police. Nathan knew better than to bring this into a criminal courtroom where Karen could spin it into a drama of oppression. He went to the Civic Enforcement Division that handled nuisance violations, code compliance, and habitual abusers of municipal resources. He scheduled a meeting, sat across from a tired man with a desk full of folders, and played the video. There were no theatrics. Just silence, then a sigh, then the man reaching for a complaint log. Karen's name was there, already flagged twice for unrelated neighborhood disputes, one unresolved. Nathan submitted a formal statement, left the footage, and returned home. He didn't feel victorious. He felt methodical, quiet, ready for whatever came next, and it came faster than expected. 2 days later, a city truck pulled up in front of Karen's house. Not police, compliance officers. They spoke to her at the door, clipboard in hand, and issued something she didn't expect, a formal cease and desist for targeted nuisance violations. She tried to argue. She gestured wildly, but the officer simply pointed at the clipboard, then the street camera mounted on the lamppost. Nathan hadn't even known that existed, but it had caught her movements as well. The timing had finally caught up with her. That evening, she approached Nathan's porch, not yelling, not smiling, just standing there with her hands at her sides as if waiting for something to give. He opened the door, leaned on the frame, and waited. "You could have let it go," she said, not angry, but something worse, disappointed. "You didn't have to make it public." Nathan met her eyes. "Neither did you. But here we are." She didn't argue. She didn't threaten. She just turned and walked away. And for the first time since the whole thing had started, Nathan believed she might not come back. Spring arrived without much ceremony that year. No dramatic blooms, no sudden warmth, just a slow lifting of the air, the kind of shift you only notice when you've been waiting for it without realizing. Nathan found himself waking earlier, sleeping more soundly, and stepping into the garage each morning with less tension in his shoulders. It wasn't that Karen had vanished entirely. Her house was still there, the blinds always drawn, the lawn tended to by someone else now, but her presence had become muted, residual, like the last note of a song you finally stopped humming. She no longer watched from her porch, no longer paced the sidewalk when Nathan left for errands. Whether it was the city citation, the footage, or something deeper that had finally broken her momentum, she had stopped her campaign. And that silence, more than any apology or punishment, was what gave Nathan peace. The garage had changed. Not just physically, though the upgrades were real. New shelves, a wall-mounted cabinet system, overhead lights that cast a clean white clarity over every surface. But in feel, it had become what it was always meant to be. A place not of defense, but of craft. Nathan spent hours there, not out of necessity, but out of want. He fixed things not because they were broken, but because the process satisfied something in him. A stubborn bolt, a seized bearing, a rusted hinge, he didn't fight them. He listened, tested, worked, and repaired. There was an honesty to that rhythm that grounded him more than any legal victory could. One afternoon, while organizing a set of torque wrenches, he found the old padlock Karen had installed during the early stages of her intrusion. It had been tossed aside after he'd removed it, forgotten in a drawer. He turned it over in his hands for a long moment. It was nothing, cheap, scratched, flimsy. But it had once symbolized something far heavier, the first real violation of boundary, the moment when assumption turned into occupation. He considered throwing it out, but instead placed it on a shelf beneath the workbench, not as a trophy, but as a reminder. That same week, a letter arrived from the city, not a warning or citation, but a closure report. Confirmation that the complaint against him had been officially dismissed and flagged as retaliatory. Gloria had already told him this verbally, but seeing it in print, stamped and signed brought a certain satisfaction. It was done. Not just paused or avoided, but closed, documented and resolved. He scanned the letter, filed the original, and didn't mention it to anyone. Around that time, neighbors began to speak to him again, slowly, casually, but with a kind of tentative friendliness. One of the dog walkers offered a nod. The woman across the street asked if he knew a good local roofer. A couple of teenagers walking past complimented his vintage motorcycle. No one brought up Karen, No one apologized. But the shift was clear. The story had changed. He was no longer the angry recluse or the man making trouble. He was the guy with the clean garage, the working tools, the quiet consistency. Reputation, he had learned, didn't come from defense. It came from routine, from showing up the same way every day until people saw you for what you were. Months later, Nathan received an envelope with no return address. Inside was a single photo, an old one, of his sister and Karen, sitting together in the backyard, arms linked, smiling into the sun. On the back, written in looping script, were the words, "For whatever it was worth, thank you for taking care of her house." He stared at it for a long time. It didn't change anything. It didn't excuse or erase, but it made something in his chest settle. Maybe Karen had once believed she was entitled to the garage because she'd felt closer to his sister than anyone else. Maybe she'd confused memories with rights, or maybe it was just guilt finally finding a way to breathe. Nathan didn't frame the photo. He didn't hang it. He placed it inside a folder marked House History and left it in the hall closet, next to the warranty documents and spare keys. By summer, the garage was fully operational. He hosted Marcus and a few of his old work buddies for a weekend barbecue, the first time music played out loud in the yard without a feeling of being watched. They ate, drank, swapped stories about busted engines and tool disasters. One of them asked about the neighborhood, and Nathan simply shrugged and said, "It's quiet now." They didn't press. They didn't need to. Later that evening, after everyone had left and the dishes were soaking in the sink, Nathan stepped out onto the porch and looked out over the yard. The moonlight hit the garage just right, illuminating the smooth edges of the new siding, the glint of fresh hardware on the door. He lit a cigar, not out of habit, but as a kind of ritual, and sat on the old patio chair with his feet stretched toward the gravel path. He didn't think about Karen. He didn't think about court or locks or inspections. He thought about torque ratios, engine grease, clean lines, and the quiet hum of a place fully reclaimed, the kind of quiet that didn't ask for attention, the kind that simply meant, "It's mine now," and always was.